Journey podcast. I am one of your hosts, David Gilliland. We have the privilege of having Thomas Bertels with Purpose Works Consulting with us today. We are so glad to have you on. Welcome to the show, Thomas.
A pleasure to be here.
We're just delighted to have entrepreneurs who have been in the trenches, who have built businesses, who are building another business, who are working, doing the hard work like the rest of us. And Thomas, why don't you just tell us, why did you get into this? How'd you start this business?
I started this business after 20 years with another consulting firm that I co-founded, Vallejo Con, and we had a nice run. But after 20 years, I decided I wanted to be a little bit closer to my professional roots and focus on a more narrow set of topics. So that's why I started this business at the start of the pandemic, actually.
Oh yeah, that was a bumpy time for several of us. Tell me, how did you already have a client base from your previous place, or did you just have to jump in and start and, find that product market fit?
Well, the good news is I had a number of clients. Like, having been in the space for some 20 some years, I had a few people that I could call on. But you know how it is in professional services, right? It's like things change really quickly. Clients retire, right? So you can never really rely on those client relationships to be there. You gotta keep building on that.
Yeah, and at the beginning, it's always that you eat what you kill, and so you're kind of feasting and then famine in that professional service that you're talking about. At some point, you had to shift. You had to kind of add some team members, keep some stability, grow that regular. What was that like for you?
Yeah, it was interesting. Coming from a larger organization, right, where we had established all that infrastructure, the temptation was to kind of like go in there and kind of rebuild all of this, albeit on a much smaller scale. And I caught myself early on and realized there's probably only like a number of people that I can actually do well. And so I decided to focus on like a handful of topics and avoid the temptation to do like a million things. And I found that actually helped out quite a bit. And ultimately, you got to go where the passion and the energy is, right? So if you hate writing blog posts, don't write blog posts, right? If you love doing interviews, right, maybe you want to do a podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. You you mentioned that you focused in on a few things, your passion things. Tell me a little bit about your passion. What's your why? What's your purpose? Since it's in the name, I'm assuming you yourself have got a pretty strong purpose.
Yeah, so my mission really is to make work better, and more specifically to make it more productive, to make it more meaningful, to make it more impactful, and ultimately more motivating for the people who do the work. And so I've been in that space for the last 25 years, mostly focusing on the productivity aspect, right? So working with medium or large organizations to look at their business processes and see, right, how can we make this better, faster, cheaper? And then about 15 years, I got introduced to this idea of work design, which is like the other side of the coin is like, well, as we make those decisions, how does this change the experience of the employees? And how do they experience the work? Is this a job that they can't wait to get to in the morning? Or is this like the worst job in the universe? And how can you make better decisions as a manager to structure work that brings out the best in people? And so that's the space I really decided to focus on, because I always tremendously enjoy it's like the sense of a team when you help them tackle something, right? A ridiculous report that they've been asked to do for like 2 years and nobody understood that, right? Nobody ever read this thing, right? And you can get rid of like crazy work and make the work better. That's for me incredibly motivating.
Hey, talk to me about the word you used, meaningful. Meaningful in the work. And I'm going to say that some of the processes you help people think through are probably pretty mundane. So how do you put meaning in the mundane in the work? Give us an example. What's that look like? Because a lot of us have teams, and quite frankly, we hire people to do a lot of the work that we don't want to do, that we find mind numbing or that stall us out, and we get help for that. How do you create meaning in the actual work? What have you found?
Yeah, one is even like the most meaningless or mundane task, I think can be made better if you do it from start to finish.
If you gave me a poor example, what would it look like?
I'll give you an example of like a very simple example. A sandwich shop, right? You go to a sandwich shop and there are two models in the world. One is you go in there, there's a guy standing behind the counter or a gal, You tell them what you want, and they put together your sandwich. And you get your sandwich, you pay for it, you leave. The second model is that there's like 7 or 8 people in a line, and one person does the bread, the next person does the cheese, the third person does the salami, and so forth and so forth. Right? And so the problem with that model, this assembly line model, is that the person who does this tiny little bit of piece has no connection with the sandwich or you as the customer. And that's a trivial example. But like that even applies on a much tenfold more in the knowledge workspace, right? Where you have people in accounts like the person who puts the customers on credit hold, right? And that's all they see. That's all they do all day long, right? They do 2 or 3 different tasks. They don't see the entire picture. They don't even have an understanding of why what they're doing is important to the person who ultimately benefits from that. And so, again, we make design choices, right? We could make this a big job where somebody does the entire thing from start to finish, or we could just give them like a small itty bitty piece of work. And the problem is, if we give them the itty bitty piece of work, they're not going to experience the work as meaningful, meaning they're also not going to be terribly engaged. And to your other point, it's like, so some work, yes, right, it's hard to see the meaning in that, right? If you're a janitor and all you do is right, you sweep the floor, right? It's hard to see the larger picture. But there's also the story, I think, of Kennedy, right, visiting the Space Center and asking the janitor what his job is. And he's like, I helped put a man on the moon. Right? So again, sometimes people can identify with the larger mission, but sometimes also people can just take pride in doing a job well from start to finish, the entire thing. Teachers are actually a great example of that. Right? Teachers and nurses typically score very high on having motivating jobs. Why is that? As a teacher, you have control, you have autonomy in the classroom, right? You see how these kids develop. You use a number of different skills to get to them, to reach them, to teach them skills, and you get feedback, right? You see how these kids grow and prosper.
Thomas, sorry, it looks like we may have missed a piece of that. So you
Oh,
said the teachers, and then there was a cutout. Could
yeah,
you
I
repeat
can I
that?
can repeat that. I
Yes.
can repeat that. So, for example, take teachers, right? So, a teacher in the classroom, teachers typically on all surveys score fairly high in terms of experience their work as meaningful. Why is that? Because they have a lot of autonomy in the classroom. They see how the kids grow and develop, so they get feedback from how they're doing the work. They can use a number of different skills to introduce these concepts. They typically have kids, so like for the right, if you take elementary school teachers, right, for the entire day, right? So they own the education of the child, and they know why it's important. So I think that's an example for like a well-designed, intrinsically motivating job. But there's plenty of other jobs where people, again, just do a tiny sliver. They don't know what they're doing. They have no decision-making authority, and hence they're probably not going to be terribly engaged.
All right. So I think when we're a really small business, it's pretty easy to keep people engaged because, like, there's 4 or 5 people. We're all in the same room. We're doing stuff together. What about when you just start getting beyond that? And let's say you're getting to 10, 20, 30 people, and people are starting to specialize down in. What have you done on the teams you've led that have helped them find meaning?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. I think, as you say, it's typically not an issue in a startup, right? There's like 5, 6, 7 people, everybody is connected. I think as it gets larger, some companies, especially as you bring in like managers from really large companies, right? So they apply their craft and they break things into smaller pieces, and maybe we offshore part of this, and right? We have colleagues in India and Australia and the Philippines and so forth. Um, and they break up so like the jobs, and I think that's a huge mistake. I think as an entrepreneur, I think you should look at really it's like the job is a product and design it well for the person doing it. And that oftentimes means that giving people, maybe instead of taking the marketing task and saying, okay, right, one person writes the tweet, the next person posts the tweet, the third person, right, checks the reaction, the first person writes a report, have one person do the entire job. As you do more tweets, just have a second person that does the entire thing. That's an example for that is actually there's a very large company, Haier, a Chinese white goods manufacturer, so refrigerators, ovens, and so forth. And they really built their entire business model around creating micro enterprises where you have 15, 20, 25 people, or like a little business in themselves with, chief executive and so forth. And so they try to keep these companies small. Another example is Gore-Tex, right? They're famous for the moment it's like a business unit grows above 100 people, they divide it in half, and then both parts grow. So I think there's a lot of benefit for like keeping things intact and not breaking it apart too much.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it kind of goes against some of the thinking that we've had, and some of the what tasks can you offload, and getting clarity around those. That's a lot of fun. Let's make and keep this on a personal level now, and shift to you building your business. So not necessarily around the roles now, but just the challenges. It's not easy. You start adding people on payroll. You're doing those kinds of things. What are some of the challenges that you've seen as you've been growing in your business, either your current one or the last one, that you're like, man, this took some doing. We had to figure this out. It could be all across the board, but just give me a couple of the challenges. You're like, this was a big one, and here's when we finally broke through. Here's what happened. And
Yeah. So I think one big topic for me is focus, and it's like owning a space. Right. And I think in professional services, the temptation always is, right? You see an opportunity, there's a client need, and you jump on it and you say, oh, we can help you with that. And if you're not super careful, you end up with like a portfolio of work that ranges, right, from the weird to the wonderful, right? But it becomes really, really hard for the client to remember who you are and what you do, besides that you're a smart person that likes to help, right? And so I found actually that the moment, like in this current venture, when I said it's all about the work and that's the box that I live in, it becomes really easy to figure out what fits into the box and what doesn't fit into the box. And sometimes that's really hard, right? You're kind of like, 1 month away from starvation, and you really need, right, some work to fill the pipeline, is to say no to seductive opportunities. But I found that incredibly powerful, because one is, I think it dilutes your expertise, right, in the eyes of the client, right? And it just doesn't help you build like a consistent book of business that's attractive to people. So that's one. I think the second one is, there are no shortcuts, specifically when it comes to people. So sometimes, right, you land a project and all of a sudden you have more work than you have. And then I think it's very tempting to just like throw, right, resources that maybe you haven't properly vetted into that project. And I made that mistake, I must admit, previously a few times. And so I also, in this iteration of my venture, decided that I really, want to focus on working with people where, I'm very confident that they can stand up in front of the client and deliver. It's like the value proposition, right? Versus it's like somebody I haven't worked with, that I don't know so well. So quality control, I think, is incredibly important, especially in professional services.
all right, so I mean, I heard you share those two key things. I mean, one thing, people sometimes think the word strategy is this mystical word, and they don't quite get their hands around it. But the way you said it was just right. It's like, find your space and own it. Say no to everything else. That's the top strategic decision, right? Like, who do we serve? What do they need to accomplish? How do we help them do it? Like, let's just get very clear. And then the second one, the team really matters. And you hit pretty heavily on their competency, ability to actually deliver, rather than just let's throw bodies in there who we think will be good enough. Let's prove it out. Tell me a little bit about outside of competency. Have you ever found anything in a team member like highly competent but really bad for our business?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one, and you're right, that was like a shortcut, right, to look at just the competence. But there's also this topic of the long flight, right? So just picture yourself, you're about to hire this person, and you're about to jump on a 6-hour flight to, right, New York to LA. And you're gonna sit next to each other for 6 hours, right? Are you gonna like start grabbing start biting your nails after like 15 minutes and saying, oh my God, what am I gonna talk about? Right? Or you're actually gonna have a great experience, right? So I think the ability to enjoy that person, and outside, so like the immediate task to be done, for me, I think is very important. Right? I
Yeah.
think that goes into like culture and chemistry. And to your point, right? Sometimes we over-index on performance, right? So the person who builds the most is the best person, and I think that gives like short change to the people that oftentimes are like the foundation of the business, right?
Yeah.
They're reliable, they're consistent, right? You don't lose sleep when you send them on a job, and so over the years, I learned that those qualities are incredibly important, and stay away from like the high maintenance personas, because they take away the time that you need to build the business.
Yeah, and the energy and the joy just
Yeah,
saps right out of you.
yeah.
Hey, well, thank you. You're with us. You're building a business too. What challenges are you currently trying to wrestle with and facing that maybe we could wrestle with together a little bit? Anything come to mind? Like, right now, this is something I'm working on.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I find incredibly challenging, I think the pandemic has accelerated that, is just the ability to get through to people. I feel like everybody is so busy, right? They're looking at their email in the morning and they start out at like, even if they're like inbox zero people, right? They start out with 250 emails in the start of the day. And so it just becomes harder and harder, I think, to punch through the noise and stay top of mind for people. Because people's lives are incredibly busy. So I think that's one big challenge that I think everybody in professional services struggles with.
Yeah. Yeah. What kinds of things have you tried? What kinds of things are proving a little better than others, or pathways you've gone down, you're like, well, that doesn't work. Let's learn together through this.
Yeah, I think one thing, and everybody, I think a lot of people tell you that is like, really the focus on delivering value in each interaction, right? I think incredibly important to build sustainable client relationships. And right, again, it's like if you just call to get like a next gig, right? That's like fairly one-sided, right? So I always try to like build very long-term client relationships, because I know that they might not need me, right, for next year or the year afterwards, but maybe in 4 or 5 years. So it's definitely worthwhile to stay in touch. And it's also, quite frankly, just nice to see in general, like how people grow and develop and what challenges they're facing. So I think it really pays off to have a very long-term view of like client relationship management and business development. So that's one piece. I think the other challenge is, quite frankly, it's like motivation, right? I mean, it's like the old Harry Truman thing: the buck stops here, right? Where, right? So you're ultimately the person who owns all of these things, and I think it's really challenging to like maintain your energy and drive right through all the ups and downs, and not get demotivated and frustrated when things don't work out, because the majority of things are probably not going to work out, right? And so I find that, right, and I admit, I've had periods where I'm just like, oh, right, it's just too hard, right? Maybe, right, maybe it's time to get like a paycheck and have somebody else worry about those things, right? And
Yeah.
so I think having the resilience, I think, to get through those times, I think is really
Yeah. Sometimes we think entrepreneurs have this unbreakable spirit, this undying optimism,
yeah,
but the reality is some mornings it's dead. And we've got to do some things, right? Like
yeah.
we have to do some things anyway. And it's not because we are just born with resilience. It's I think it's built. Thomas, what sort of practices or what do you do to refuel, to refocus, to re-energize, to get that? I'm moving to the next level. I'm getting past this. What I'm going on to the next. What are your practices that help you stay
I have a
focused?
very, you're going to appreciate this. I have a very bizarre practice to re energize myself, but I have a little podcast myself, right, called Work Matters. And, we try to put out an episode every 2 weeks in 2 seasons, like 15, 20 episodes a year. Um, but one is, I think it gives me a rhythm, right? Because I'm like, oh, right, we're running short on episodes. I got to, right, find some interesting people to talk to and interview. And secondly, it's like free R&D in a way, right? I get to talk to other people in the space who have quite interesting ideas. It keeps me on my toes. It avoids that you becomes like a little bit this endless repetition, right? You always have the same message, and it keeps you on your toes and evolves, I think, the body of work that you're involved in. And so I found that really super helpful and, quite frankly, humbling, right? Because most of the time I think I'm pretty smart, and then I talk to like some of my guests and I'm like, oh, right, I completely missed that for the last 20 years, right? How can that be? And so I find that incredibly helpful, to also stay connected, like, with the outside world, and not just stew in your own stew in your own pot, so to speak.
I love that. So you're actually using community to
Yeah,
strengthen you, intentionally tapping into people's ideas you can just like play with. be wrestled to the ground with, or even right, like just changed, and keep that mental agility and resilience going. So I love that. Thanks for the example, Thomas. Uh, as as you've grown businesses, sometimes it can become all demanding because, well, we might be running out of cash that month, or or key team members might be leaving, or things falling apart in certain areas that really pull us in. And we've all had to do that. How do you manage personal life during a time of work crisis?
So, I mean, one thing that helps is I have an incredibly persistent 7-year-old who, is, is very clear when he needs time, and so that keeps you on your toes. Besides that, I think it's really hard, right? I mean, everybody says, "Oh, right, you should whatever, right? Shut things down at 6 or 7." You just can't. But if it's your business, you're always on. You're always thinking about it, right? Oftentimes, it's fun.
Yeah,
Right? It's like,
yeah,
it's not like, it's like, gee, I hate thinking about work on a Saturday. Sometimes I have my best ideas, right? I take a walk, right? But you get to this point where you burn out, where
yeah,
just like nothing new comes out. And so I think just living through those times, right? Whether you right can take a week off and go to the beach and, readjust your mindset, or whether you just suffer through that and live with the fact that you're not super productive, right? But I think we all have like these ups and downs, and sometimes the personal life that impacts the professional life. Like sometimes it's the other way around. I think it's important to be forgiving to yourself, right? It's like nobody can deal with all of it all the time, right? We're all just struggling through. Right. Some
yeah,
days we're better than others. The good news is I think is there's always going to be another day, right? Where I think we can try something else, right? We can charge, we can find a better way of dealing with the issues that we have, or maybe they just go away sometimes, right? So I think that again to the point of resilience, I think, and just saying, hey, I'll do the best I can, and that's all I can do.
yeah. I, Sometimes we get in our head, we look sideways at that other business owner or whatever from the outside, thinking, how do they hold it all together? And a reminder that no, we don't. We just get through it, right? We
Yeah.
just get through it in the end. And if we're still breathing at the end of it, that means we weren't conquered, right? We made it. Keep going, right?
Sometimes
Thank
you just
you.
don't even have an option, right? There's a
There's nothing else we can do.
there is no plan B, right? There's just plan A. And so, yeah, what's the alternative, right? If you got like 20, 30, 50 people depending on you, right? What's the alternative, right? Call it quits, right? Let everybody else, right, suffer through that disruption. No, I think you got to get through it, right? I think it helps though. I think again, this idea, and I know that you're a big proponent of this, right? Do not just put it all on your shoulders, but really look at this and say, okay, there's so much work to be done. Let's invite other people into it, and not just as people who do the work, but also people who drive the bus. I
Yeah.
think that's incredibly important.
And sometimes, like, we worry, like, well, but if they understood how delicate this is right now, how close we are to them not getting their secure paycheck this week, or whatever, right? Um, we fear
Yeah.
that if they knew, would they leave? Have you ever had a moment where you kind of needed to let the team in and maybe were surprised by how well they responded? Or
Yeah, I don't remember. I definitely had that moment twice, actually, right? When it's like all of a sudden, right, the air goes out of the business, right? You lose a long-term client just because, right, after 4 or 5 years of steady work, right, they got taken over, right? And
yeah,
so they're not going to do anything. And then the second client says, "Thank you so much for all the great work you've done for the last 3 years. I think we're self-sufficient now." Right. And the third client says, it's a really tough time. We're going to cut back our spending on consultants. And all of a sudden, that's 2/3 of your revenue. Right. And you get like 15 people looking at you and you're like, right, what's going on?
yeah,
So as you have to make those adjustments, I find it incredibly hard. I hate it every single time to go through these things. It's life, right? We expand and we all enjoy it. Sometimes it contracts and right, we don't enjoy it at all, right?
yeah,
And I think it's just the reality of it. I think to the extent you can be transparent, I think that's good. On the other side, again, right? Sometimes it's just right. You're just one step away from right the next project coming through the door. So it's also, I think, as a leader, you got to take some of that stress, right, and hold that in, freak everybody else out, right? We're saying, "Oh my God, we're at the end of the cliff," right? That's not particularly helpful, right? Start thinking about how you get over the cliff, right, and try to do this as humane as
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah. When you have it all pull out from under you, that contraction has to happen. And then the humanity, I really appreciate that you brought that up, because sometimes I think we, as just people, I'm not going to say owners, I'll just say people in general, we want to protect ourselves from intense pain. And it's a lot easier to vilify and shut them out and not feel it. And well, they've been just like baggage all this time. I've been trying to carry them. They've never stepped up, or, blame it, instead of just see the humanity, know that life's hard sometimes, and to go ahead and feel it. We know it's going to impact their families. We know it's going to impact them, and yet still believe and know, and they are going to do well in their next place, right? And how do I help make this as easy, as gentle as possible? And how do I cheer them on as I have to send them out, right? The really painful spot. But you tapped into another power that for me has helped sometimes. When the times get difficult, you said, you were like, you've got all these people. You're like, well, you can't let them down. You almost feel like I'm going to get up in the morning. I'm going to figure this out because they matter so much to me, right? So sometimes when I can't get out of sight of myself, they pull me out because I'm going to step it up. I'm going to do better because they matter so much to me. And I think sometimes we don't recognize as business owners or remember that source of obligation is one of the things that pulls us out of the hole, pulls us out of that depth. Sometimes it's just like, but I've got to step up for them. And we do, right?
I think it's super important what you just say, and we all know it, right? If you
Right.
look at your professional experience, what are you proud of? I think rarely people say it's like towards the end of their life, right? Oh, it's like, over my life, I generate 140 million in revenue and 78.3 million EBITDA. I think what stands out is the people that you hired, who you helped grow and develop. And I mean, my father was a teacher. He's now retired. But it was fascinating. My nephews go to the same kindergarten that I used to go to. So I visit my parents, and I was chatting with the kindergartner, and it turns out she was a student of my father some 30 years ago. And it was fascinating. She said, like, I was so grateful, I was like, I wanted to do this professionally, and he steered me into a different direction. And I told that to my dad, and I know that he was proud, right? And I think there are all these stories about, for example, teachers like, savings, like the cards that their former students sent them, right? Or a professor, right, that's still in touch with a former student. And I think that's quite frankly how we keep score as human beings. I think the impact that we have on the world, right? And so I think that sometimes gets lost in this, like, well, we got to make the next quarter and the earnings per share. And it's like business is not a family, right? Because you can't, right? You can't get
Yeah.
rid of family members that easy, right? But it's still a gathering of humans that come together for a common purpose, and that gives us energy, right? And the money is like the secondary variable, right? I think if you build the right culture, and you help people thrive, the money will always come.
Yeah. Well, Thomas, I think those are some great words of wisdom you shared. If anyone wants to get in touch with you in the future, since this is a podcast, they have to hear it. How would they do that?
Yeah, so the easiest way is to go to our website. It's www.uorks. There's no .com. It's one of these new domain names. So that's the easiest way. I think another way is we have a website for a book we put out, Fixing Work. It's like a fable that tells the story of how a leader redesigns work. And that also, I think, has a lot of information about the work that I've been doing, which is fixing-work. So those are two ways that people can get in touch.
Fantastic. That wraps up today's episode of the Seven Figure Journey podcast, where we explore the ins and outs of the seven figure journey. Thomas, thank you for being a guest on our show today. We loved having you on the show. For all of you listening in, I hope you will share, like, do all the things to make this episode more available to all the other 7-figure business owners out there. Keep striving, keep learning, keep caring, keep pushing towards your goals. And until next time.